Hello, my friends. Welcome to my corner. Many years ago, when I was reading the winners of the Nobel Prize in Literature, I entered the world of Halldór Laxness through a novel that fascinated me, and that was World Light. It's a novel that not many people mention when they talk about Laxness, but that was my introduction to him, and I was absolutely amazed by it. After that, I read a couple more books by him that I'm going to share with you in a second. But the one that I always kept meaning to read was Sjálfstætt fólk, or Independent People. I noticed a couple of weeks ago that my local library had acquired the Everyman's Library edition and the translation of this great novel by Laxness, so I thought this is a great opportunity. It's a wonderful excuse to finally read this book and to revisit the work of an author that I have greatly enjoyed. So this is the novel that I want to tell you about today. But before we get to it, let me share with you some other works by Laxness, as I told you before. These are the ones that I have. I don't have all of his works, but I wanted to share with you some books that I found here in my room. The first one that I got by him was this little, well, not little, it's quite a large volume in Spanish from Aguilar Publishers. It's a collection of the Nobel Prize in Literature, the Nobel laureates. And it only gets to a certain point. After the 60s, I believe, or some of the 70s, apparently the publisher went out of business. So I managed to get this one. I'm going to show you the opening pages here. They always include a picture of the author. And this includes two works. Most of the time when you get books from this collection, they include a lot more than that. Maybe you get 8 or sometimes 10 or 12 works. But one of the books that is included here, World Light, is quite long. So for that reason, they were only able to include 2. And the other one that is available here is Iceland's Bell, that historical novel by Laxness that focuses on the 17th and 18th century. So I first read Laxness in Spanish, and let me tell you, he reads wonderfully in Spanish also. A few years after that, I went to Buenos Aires and I found this book, which is also from a Nobel Prize collection, and this is Paradise Reclaimed. Okay, so you have Paraíso Reclamado. It's a great novel, part of which takes place here in the US because the hero or the protagonist travels to Salt Lake City. There are comments on Mormonism and an exploration of that worldview and that lifestyle and that religion here. So it's a really interesting novel and I enjoyed it very much. I also read Under the Glacier, and I'm going to be honest with you about this one. This one did not particularly speak to me. I keep wondering if maybe it has to do with the time at which I read it. Maybe I had too much on my mind. Maybe it was just not the right time for me. It's a very brief text, so I may revisit it someday and see what it was that went wrong with me. But this was one of the Laxness novels that did not really speak to me that much, not as the others had. And a couple of books that I have by him that I am still looking forward to enjoy. This one is The Fish Can Sing. I am really attracted by the type of story that it tells, so this is probably the one that I'll be reading next. And I also managed a long time ago, when it was difficult to find a copy of Salcavalca. As you may know, this was translated again recently, a couple of years ago maybe, or 1 year ago, and it's easily available right now. This is an edition from 1936, and one interesting thing about it is that it's not really a translation directly from Icelandic, but a translation from the Danish edition, but that Laxness later on revised or looked at. So I don't think it's too problematic for me. I'm still going to enjoy this version of it. But you know how it is when it comes to a work that has been translated from a language that it's not the original. So if I read any of these novels soon after this video, I'll tell you a little bit more about them. But let's focus now on Independent People, which is the one that I have just finished reading. What kind of book is this? This is a good old novel of the land, which is the genre that the Nobel Prize Committee used to favor, especially at the beginning. Halldór Laxness won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1955. And let me read you the citation so that we can keep that in mind as we continue to look at this work by him. So the citation says that Laxness was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, quote, for his vivid epic power, which has renewed the great narrative art of Iceland. So the word epic there really stands out. And another important word right there is renewed. Okay, so he continues a tradition, but he's also doing something with it, of course, because we are talking about 20th century literature. So Independent People is 500 pages in length. It is divided into 5 parts. And within those parts, we have many different chapters, brief chapters for the most part, some of them longer than others. And in terms of the genre, I would say that this is poetic realism. That's how I would describe it. Not just realism, but a poetic type of realism. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what I mean by that as we look at the novel. It shows us the struggle of a character against superstition, against nature, against other people, against his own people, his own family sometimes, and ultimately I would say against himself, or at least not the struggle against himself, but maybe trying to come to terms with his life and who he is and the code that he lives by. I really like this novel, among other things, because I feel that it's really balanced. Okay, so you have great description and great dialogue, a great individual character, but also a wonderful depiction of a community. So all of these things you're going to find in Independent People, and I think that's one of the reasons why people consider it to be a masterpiece. So now that we have looked at some general information, let's look at the different parts that this novel is divided into. As I told you before, it's 5 parts that we are looking at. And as we go, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the themes that you can find in these individual parts. So the first part is titled Icelandic Pioneer. And I really like the opening because the novel opens with local myths. Okay, especially when it comes to 2 evil spirits, the spirits of Kolumkili and Gunvor, who are said to live in the land that Bjartur of Summerhouses, our protagonist, is coming to inhabit. So that is really important because you see, you have a character here who is moving to a place that people believe is haunted. That is not a good thing most of the time, and that is something that is revisited as we read the novel and as we hear the story of this character. Now, we meet our protagonist immediately after hearing about these myths of these 2 evil spirits who seem to inhabit this place. Bjartur. Okay, Bjartur is a really interesting man in the sense that he is dedicated to independence. There's the connection with the title that you can see. Okay, to him, the paramount thing, the most important thing in life is to be independent. He says that if a man is not independent, he's not really a man. And in this case, when he says man, he really means man. Okay, it's not one of those cases and he's talking about, human beings in general. Now, he's really talking about men in particular. So we meet him. Soon after that, we're talking about the first 20, 30 pages of the novel, he marries Rosa. Okay, a very different person, and they come to live in their own land. Okay, so to him, independence is the big thing, and independence to him means having your own piece of land and also not owing money to anybody. So he has come to that point. He has been able to achieve that. He comes here with his wife, right? He just loves nature. Nature is his church, he says, or something to that effect. He loves sheep also. He really likes sheep. And Rosa, as I told you, is kind of different. Okay, for example, she's really cautious when it comes to the local myths. She's not going to go against these myths or question them or anything like that. Bjartur, on the other hand, is more inclined to think of myths as superstition. He says, I have my 5 senses and I don't need other senses or anything else besides that. So he is really a down-to-earth person in that sense. In this first part, one of the passages that really stood out to me is Bjartur's exchange with the minister. So look out for that because it gives you a great example of the type of humor that you can find in this work by Laxness and also in many others. Then we have the second part titled Free of Debt. And the cool thing about this one is that it takes place 12 years after the first part. So a lot has happened here. Bjartur has a daughter, okay, and she is 12 going on 13. So Laxness is really good at making those jumps in time and then telling you about what happened in that part that you did not really witness directly. And there are quite a few important events in the second part. For example, Bjartur is given a cow and he is not happy about that because remember, he likes sheep. Cows, he doesn't want to deal with cows. Okay, so all of a sudden he has a cow here and he has to take care of it and deal with that. There's a key episode here that has to do with Bjartur and his daughter. Her name is Asta Solilia, going to the town. So what that introduces in the novel is another key theme, or even a dichotomy, if you want to look at it that way, which is the rural space and the urban space, and the contrast that exists between those two spaces. You can also see this in Asta Solilia's behavior. For example, she really wants to be educated. She wants an education. And Bjartur is really cautious about that. Not because he does not like the concept of education itself, but because he is really, not trustworthy of the things that happen in the town. So he doesn't want her to go to the town and to acquire the ways of life of the city, right? So once he realizes that Asta Solilia really wants to learn, he teaches her how to read himself. So it's not the education that he is against, but this idea of, be careful with the city, because there are all sorts of weird things going on in those places. In this second part, at one point there's a stranger that comes to live in Bjartur's land. He stays there for a while, and he actually makes a very deep impression on the people who live there, especially on Asta Solilia. And then another important thing about this part, a theme that also becomes important throughout the rest of the novel, is the political dimension. So politically in this part you already see that there's some talk about cooperative societies. And of course Bjartur is suspicious about this, because he is suspicious about pretty much everything except himself. So look out for that dimension right there, because that part, the political aspect, is really an important part of Independent People as a novel. The third part is titled Hard Times, and the title really describes what happens in this part of the novel. This one focuses really on Asta Solilia, and especially on her by herself, because at this point Bjartur leaves the land, and he basically leaves his daughter in charge of the place. Later on there's a character who arrives. He's a teacher, and it turns out that Bjartur has sent him to take care of the kids and make sure that everything is all right. But for a long time Asta Solilia is basically by herself, taking care of the family and all that that entails. So there are a lot of developments here in this part. A lot of stuff happens, especially when it comes to Bjartur's kids. He has 3 sons and 1 daughter. So we hear about their fates in this part of the novel, and the things that happen to them, which I'm not going to reveal because I don't want to spoil this reading experience for you. Another thing that becomes important in this part, Hard Times, is the idea that the place may be haunted, and that there may be these evil spirits on the loose here, causing things to happen to the people who inhabit this place that they consider to belong to them. So that's another thing to kind of look out for when you're reading the novel. And I would say that most importantly, the theme that I found to be most interesting in this part is the awakening of love in the character of Asta Solilia. Remember, she's a young girl, so she is awakening to life, and that's one of the things that Laxness explores in this part of the novel. After that, the fourth part is titled Years of Prosperity. So after Hard Times, we have Years of Prosperity. That makes sense, and that also gives you an idea of that balance that I was telling you about in this novel. This part, Years of Prosperity, begins with a discussion of World War I. So that situates the action at a specific time. And it's very interesting because you see the war actually has been beneficial to this town in which the action takes place. So when you hear these characters talking about the war in an ironic manner, with sarcasm and with humor, even if it is dark humor, it's really not the kind of thing that you would expect when it comes to World War I. And let's keep in mind that this novel was published in the 30s. So it's really, really interesting how this part begins, and I was really struck by that aspect of it. We also see more of Gvendur, who is one of Bjartur's sons in this part. He's trying to figure out his life, trying to figure out his love life too, and how that is going to play out. So we also get a lot of that thread, that narrative thread in this part. And another important thread has to do with Bjartur's efforts to build a house for himself. And when I say a house, I mean a house that is actually worthy of the name. He really wants something, a structure, a place that you can say, okay, I have settled here, and this house is really the proof of that. It's the evidence that this place belongs to me, and it's a house that I have built myself, and it's well built, right? So that is another aspect of this part titled Years of Prosperity. And after that, of course, we have the final part of the novel. The title is simply Conclusion. Okay, so it's a very brief part that Laxness left for the very last, but it's also very rich. And there are two themes that I could find that are prominent in this part. One of them is confrontation. This happens in the political sphere. And then on the other hand, almost in contrast, we have reconciliation, but that it happens at the personal sphere. So the political and the personal are brought together in this final part of the novel, which I thought was really effective and really well done. Independence, you're going to see, is tied very, very tightly to the concept of solitude. Okay, so I thought that was something to highlight when it comes to this novel. This can be seen in that epigraph that I shared with you at the beginning of this video, that phrase from the novel. And as you may know, and you may have realized, this epigraph really is an echo of a famous sentence or a famous phrase from Ibsen's An Enemy of the People. Right? You could probably make that connection because it's one of Ibsen's most famous quotes, and it is actually quoted in Independent People in the novel. The one that says, "The strongest man in the world is he who stands most alone." Okay, from Ibsen's An Enemy of the People. This connection, right, between independence, between freedom, right, between strength and the concept of solitude. So that phrase by Ibsen was quoted to me or shared with me a very long time ago by somebody that that was very close to my heart, somebody who's not with us anymore. But I always kept thinking about that sentence right there. You know, the strongest man in the world is he who stands most alone. What does that really mean? Does it mean that solitude makes you strong? Does it mean that if you are strong, that will cause you to be alone and to live in solitude? Does it mean both? You know, so just some food for thought here when it comes to the connection between independence and solitude, which is something that you can find in that play by Ibsen, but also in this great novel by Laxness, and he really takes up that idea. So I want to share with you, now that we have looked at the parts of the novel and some of the themes and some of the ideas, 5 features that I think make this novel a great novel. Okay, so the first one that I want to share with you is just the exquisite sense of humor. Okay, this is a sense of humor that is very local, so it may be unlike any type of sense of humor that you have experienced before. That was the case for me, obviously, because I come from a very different culture that has a very different sense of humor, and it is quite often a very dark sense of humor. So that's the first feature of this novel that I wanted to share with you. The second one just has to do with the brilliant descriptions of nature. Okay, Laxness really takes his time when it comes to this, and I think that shows the respect that he has for the land. So that's another one. Number 3, a genuine portrayal of a community. Okay, Laxness does not romanticize the community, he does not ridicule the community, he's just in the middle, he presents them as real people. And that is also wonderful about this novel. Then the fourth one is just a masterful storytelling. He is a really good narrator. The pace is just perfect. It's not too fast, it's not too slow, it's just right. So look out for that also. And finally, the last point that I wanted to mention that may be a little bit obvious is that this novel features a memorable and a complex protagonist. Okay, Bjartur of Summer Houses, he may seem harsh to you at many points in the novel, but he is in fact quite sensitive, you're going to realize. He has his own moral code, and it's very clear, you know, the way that he acts and why he does the things he does. That is very, very clear, and it is in keeping with this moral code that he lives by. So as I read the novel, I really experienced quite a wide range of emotions towards him. So that tells me at least that he's a three-dimensional character, because that's the way usually that we relate to other people in real life. You know, if we spend a lot of time with some people, you're going to experience a lot of emotions, a wide range, and that is what happened to me with Bjartur. So that's why I wanted to highlight this aspect of the novel. And to give you a sense of the style and the words and the poetry of Independent People, I thought I would share a couple of quotes with you from the novel. So let me do that. We are going to begin with little passage here that deals with nature, so that you get an idea of how that is present in this novel. This is from page 186 if you have the Everyman's Library edition of the novel. And it says, "After a day or two the brook had grown little again, and all the snow had melted from the mountain. Had the brook lost its charm then? No, far from it. Clear and joyful it flowed over the shining sand and pebbles, between its banks white with withered grass, its joy eternally new, every spring for 1,000 years. And it told little stories in its own little tongue, in its own little inflections, while the boy sat on the bank and listened for 1,000 years. The boy and eternity, two friends, the sky cloudless, and an ending. Yes. And that's how one of the chapters ends. So it gives you an idea of how nature is described in this novel, and that respect that I was telling you about before that I feel that Laxness has for the land and for nature herself. Another passage that is also related to nature has to do with Asta Solidia when she is looking at the clouds in another scene. This is from page 250 in that same edition. So it begins, it's a paragraph that begins, but higher than all dealers and societies stand the dreams of the heart, especially in the autumn when dusk is falling and the clouds of the world are full of marvelous pictures. Asta Solilia sits by the window watching them. And I'm going to skip a little bit. And then from the heavens there gleam remote continents with varicolored oceans and protean seaboards, fairy lands, cities. Up from the glass-green sea rise purple-red palaces which submerge once more with their towers, and the ocean dissolves and transforms itself into a fruitful orchard encircled by fantastic mountains with living peaks that curtsy low and fall into an embrace before they finally disappear. She had never sat by the window like that before. Once again, the majestic of nature. And the final one that I wanted to share with you, which is from page 474, has to do with the insight into politics, for example. He says, the essence of being a poor peasant is the inability to avail oneself of the gifts which politicians offer or promise, and to be left at the mercy of ideals which only make the rich richer and the poor poorer. So those moments of insight, you're going to find many of them, many quotable phrases in this novel also. And I wanted to give you an example of that. Bottom line, Independent People is a masterpiece, just plain and simple. I cannot recommend this novel enough to you. And I also wanted to recommend a movie to you, maybe as a way to preface your reading of Independent People, or maybe to accompany it, or maybe after you have read the novel. But I do recommend that you watch this movie before or as you're reading the novel. And I'm talking about the movie Rams from 2015 by the filmmaker Grímur Hákonarson. Of course, this was remade later on as a movie in English, but I am talking about the original movie from Iceland. I think it's going to give you a lot of insight into the land, the people, the culture of Iceland. And I'm going to tell you, as I read Independent People, even though there's not a lot of connection, there's not a whole lot of connection between the novel and the movie, I kept thinking about this movie, and I was so glad that I had seen it, because I felt that watching that movie had really helped me to understand this novel a little bit more. So I would say that if you are new to Laxness, Independent People is probably a very, very good place to start. It's probably the place to start, if you ask me. And the same if you're one of those readers who maybe are not precisely attracted to this author, but you're like, I would like to experience one work by him. I would say Independent People is a great, wonderful option, really. But I'm going to say this also. I recommend reading World Light, okay? It's going to require a little bit of your time because it's a rather long text, but I believe it's definitely worth it. And even after reading or having read Independent People, I would say that World Light is so far my favorite novel by Laxness. No other novel by him that I have read has left that same impression on me as that one did. So yes, please, do not neglect World Light if you do want to spend some time with this author. So do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Those were my 2 cents on Independent People by Halldór Laxness. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.